Welcome to Heart of a Shepherd. Our study continues in the book of Jeremiah. The title of our devotional today, The Fate of a People Standing at the Crossroads. This is Jeremiah 42 and 43, our scripture reading. Now, as a way of introduction, you and I face many crossroads in a lifetime, and each offers opportunities to determine our paths and ultimately our destiny. In the psalmist's words, there is the path of the blessed and that of the ungodly in Psalm chapter 1. The blessed, we read in Psalm 1 and verse 2, delight, and they find joy in the law of the Lord. While the foolish walk in the counsel of the ungodly, they stand in the way of sinners, and they keep company with the scornful. Now, we read in Psalm 1 and verse 3 that the path of the blessed will prosper. But in verses 4 through 6, and that of the ungodly will waste away and come to nothing. Well, Jeremiah 42 places before us the crossroads. And it is a crossroads between choosing faith or flight. A spiritual crossroads. Consider with me Psalm 42, verses 1 through 6. Now here we find the remnant of Judah, left behind by Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem, facing a crossroads. Well, because Ishmael and his evil cohorts had assassinated Gedaliah, whom the king of Babylon made governor of Judah, in Psalm 41, the people feared Nebuchadnezzar would exact revenge on them. Now, Johanan and the people with him came to Jeremiah in chapter 42, verses 1 through 3, and they appealed to the prophet to pray and advise them regarding God's will. Now, acknowledging they were a poor remnant, they promised to do all the Lord revealed to his prophet in verse 4. 3 times they affirmed their commitment to obey the Lord, saying, whether it be good or whether it be evil, we will obey the voice of the Lord our God. Chapter 42 and verses 5 through 6. And then consider with me verses 7 through 18, the will and the word of the Lord. Now we read in verse 7, after the 10th day, the Lord revealed his will to Jeremiah. And the prophet then summoned the people in verse 8, and he declared not only the will of the Lord, but also the conditions the people must meet to enjoy God's blessings. Jeremiah revealed the Lord promised to bless the people. However, they must remain in the land that is in Judah he promised Israel as an inheritance. If they obey the Lord, he would build them into a great people and give cause for Babylon to show compassion and grant them mercy, verses 10 through 12. And yet they were warned, if they refused to obey the word of the Lord and departed to Egypt, they would suffer the sword, famine, and death, verse 13 through 16. Disobey the Lord, they would not escape God's judgment. Then look with me, if you would, verses 19 through 22, at what I've described as a foolish, disobedient people. Now, though they vowed to obey the Lord, the people were insincere, and they refused Jeremiah's counsel. They requested Jeremiah to pray for them. And still, when they heard the will of the Lord was to remain in the land, they refused, and in verse 21, they determined to go to Egypt. Well, leave it no doubt, the consequences of disobedience, Jeremiah declared in verse 22, now therefore know certainly that ye shall die by the sword, by the famine, by the pestilence, in the place whither ye desire to go and to sojourn. Consider with me a closing thought then. Jeremiah faithfully taught the people the word and the will of the Lord. And now the people face the dilemma of a spiritual crossroads and 2 decisions. Should they obey the Lord and remain in the land, God promised, I will bless you. However, should they disobey the Lord and depart for Egypt, Jeremiah foretold, the sword which ye feared shall overtake you there in the land of Egypt. Verse 16, and there ye shall die. Then Jeremiah 43. Now, we know the people rejected Jeremiah and the word of the Lord. So when Jeremiah finished speaking in verse 1, we read that there were proud men led by Azariah and Johanan who rose among the people. They admonished Jeremiah, and they even accused him of being a false prophet, saying, quote, "Thou speakest falsely. The Lord our God hath not sent thee to say, Go not into Egypt to sojourn there." In verse 2. Well, those men accused Jeremiah of betraying the people to the Chaldeans. Imagine, after 4 decades of faithful ministry, the people turned against Jeremiah. Well, tragically, having rejected the Lord and his prophets, we read in verses 4 and 5 that Johanan and his men seized the remnant of Judah. In other words, they were taking them by force, and among them was Jeremiah and the men and women and children of the king's daughters into Egypt, until there were none left in Judah. And so now we come to verses 8 through 13, what I would describe as a forewarning of judgment. Well, when the people, including Jeremiah, came to Chaldeans, we read in verse 8, "Then came the word of the Lord unto Jeremiah." You see, Jeremiah was then instructed to hide great stones in the clay in the brick kiln, which was at the entry of Pharaoh's house in Chaldeans. With the men of Judah looking on, Jeremiah declared that Nebuchadnezzar would invade Egypt and spread his royal tent over the very stones he had placed in the oven, in verse 10. They believed Egypt would be a refuge. However, Jeremiah warned them that the destruction and devastation they witnessed in Jerusalem would find them in Egypt. Well, a closing thought. Because the people disobeyed the Lord, the things the people feared followed them to Egypt. There in that nation, which was a symbol of the world in the scriptures, there they suffered the deaths and sorrows of disobedient people. Rejecting the Lord's word and his promise of blessing and protection, the people of Judah would be haunted by the sword, war, and violent deaths, famine, a scarcity of food, and plagues, disease. Everything they had sought to escape followed them out of the will of God. Now think about it. Those are the sorrows that haunt our world today. The sword, societal violence and war, high inflations, rumors of food shortages, and yes, disease. I fear today's world faces the heavy hand and darkness of God's judgment. Well, my friend, knowing that Egypt is a type of the world, I'd encourage you, get out of the world and be among God's people and dwell in his word. Cry out to the Lord. He is a God who still hears and answers prayer. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of this Heart of a Shepherd. Bye-bye.